Yesterday, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau announced that the oil and gas industry is not only going to have to stop increasing its emissions, but going forward, it's going to have to decrease them every year. This is not what the industry was expecting. And as you can imagine, there are probably some CEOs in Calgary today who are not happy. And I'm going to talk to journalist Max Fawcett about that and get his take. So welcome to the interview, Max.
Thanks for having me.
Look, what is your take on this announcement?
My take is that it is the federal government or the Liberal Party, excuse me, basically calling the bluff of the industry and saying, okay, we've heard you make promises about getting to net zero by 2050. We've seen you shift in tone in terms of how you're talking about this. So let's make it real. Let's lay out an actual roadmap for how you get to 2050 that doesn't involve magic beans and great hopes that will be realized in 2049. I mean, I think that is a big part of the industry strategy here is they are trying to rag the puck. They're saying, okay, we hear you on climate change, we hear you on emissions, so we're gonna get to net zero in 30 years. But I think implicit in that is the assumption that the bulk of the work will be done in the last 5 or 10 years. And that's not how it works. That's not how it can work. I understand why they would like it to work that way, because by then their careers will be over. They'll be safely retired and playing golf in Kelowna or wherever it might be. But from a Canadian perspective, from a global perspective, that's not good enough. And so the Liberals here are calling their bluff and saying, you need to start laying down targets that actually make sense in the near term. And that means no more emissions growth. And I'm sure that the industry will complain loudly about it. They will behave as though this is them trying to shut down the industry. But this is already where large capital holders are trying to get them to go. Eric Nuttall, who is the portfolio manager with 9 Point Energy, no friend of mine, no friend of Greta Thunberg's, a great fan of the oil and gas industry. He's been very clear that what he's pushing management teams to do is to stop spending money on growth, stop spending money on drilling, and give it back to the shareholders. So you already have the people with the money, the big capital players pushing the industry in this direction away from production growth and towards return of capital. And now the federal government is essentially sort of lining up on the same side and saying, going forward, your businesses are about profitability, about returns to shareholders. It is not about building more oil sands projects. And I'm sure that's going to really upset them. But sometimes the job of a government is to help industry go where it needs to go, not to say nice things and make it feel better about itself.
Max, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a Wood Mackenzie economist, and they had put out a study saying that the industry, the global industry, has to begin shifting to they have to decarbonize, and they have to shift to low carbon business model. And the 2020s are the critical decade because they're going to have lots of money. Right?
Yeah.
And so immediately I thought of the oil sands, because it's starting in the 2030s, you don't know what's going to happen if peak oil comes and then consumption falls and then prices fall. They won't be as profitable, and they won't have the money to decarbonize then that they will have this decade. What's your take?
I agree. I think the risk is on erring on the side of not taking this seriously enough. I understand why these companies want to chase that last barrel, and they want to build that last project, and they want to, keep chasing the dream as long as it's alive. But if they sink billions of dollars of capital into new projects, and all of a sudden the transition happens faster and demand falls more quickly, they're ruined. And that burden will ultimately fall back on taxpayers, both in Alberta and nationally. So as stewards of capital, they should be trying to err on the side of, not trying to chase the last barrel, but to chase the most profitable barrels today. And again, I understand why that's frustrating for them, because it's not how they've operated for basically their entire careers. But at the end of the day, money talks, and it would be nice if they started putting more of their money where their mouths are on this issue. They do talk a good game about reducing emissions, even though, a lot of it is we've reduced emissions from a really high level in the past, which tends to be the talking point. That's not good enough anymore. Just reducing your per barrel emissions from a super high level 10 years ago is not going to cut the mustard. People have to start seeing absolute reductions in emissions. And if it takes the federal government coming in here with both the stick and a carrot to get that done, that's what has to happen. And look, there's a certain symmetry to this. The federal government was instrumental. I will point out a federal government led by Pierre Trudeau was instrumental in getting the oil sands started. Syncrude wouldn't exist without the federal support, especially when their American business partners pulled out. Federal government has been there all along the way helping build this industry. So it makes sense that they would help guide it towards a safe landing. And that's what this really should be about is, we have a plane in the air right now that is running out of fuel. When and where do we want it to land, and how do we minimize the number of casualties? You wouldn't trust someone who said, well, let's just keep flying the plane as long as we can, right? That would be reckless. You would say, no, we need to find an airport at some point and put the plane on the ground. And that's what the government's doing here with its policies.
Now, a couple of months ago, the big five oil sands producers they announced the net zero by 2050 oil sands pathways initiative. So they're going to get to net zero by 2050. But a lot of the technology they talked about are what economist Jason Dion calls wildcard technologies. Carbon capture and storage, small modular reactors. I mean, technology promising, but we don't know that they're going to be good to go and scale up by, say, the 2030s. But that was the focus of that document. And there was a lot made of the fact that the Alberta government signed on, the federal government did not sign. You couldn't sign on. You couldn't find them in the press release. Now it seems that we maybe know why.
Yeah, absolutely. And good on the federal government for not putting their stamp on something that involved a lot of hopes and dreams. I think that's why we need to see a roadmap laid down much sooner than these companies would like. They would like us to trust them, that they will get there by 2050, and at some point technology will get them there. We don't have the luxury of being able to trust them. That simply isn't how this works, and it isn't how the market is going to treat this. That's the part about this that I find just completely bewildering. If this was just the federal government, just the Liberals, bad, evil Trudeau and his hatred of oil and gas, sure, I'm willing to entertain that as a reason. But he is behind in some respects a lot of the large institutional capital holders in New York and London who are not thinking about an election or about a political outcome, but they're worried about material economic risk to their assets, to their holdings, to their the people for whom they have a fiduciary duty. So they're not going to wait around to see if a magic bean sprouts a magic beanstalk. They need to see things happening right away. And again, the irony of the federal government here, this government, the Liberal government, is that they have done more to help the oil and gas industry probably than any other government in Canadian history. And they get no credit for it. Never mind building TMX, getting a pipeline to Tidewater, which of course the Conservative government couldn't do. Never mind LNG Canada. Never mind the money bailing out the orphan wells. The fact that they are pushing the industry in the direction of reality and in the direction of markets is probably the best thing that they could do for them. And they will get no credit here in Calgary, none from the executive class. I guess that's maybe one of the things about public life and politics is that if you do things well, you don't always get the credit for it. I think of Brian Mulroney and the GST. That was good policy. That was policy that helped get Canada's finances back on track. And he lost an election, or his party lost an election, by the biggest margin in his party's history because of it. So no good deed goes unpunished, it seems. And I think that may be the case here as well.
Well, and it seems like the Liberals are already being punished. And maybe we'll wrap up this interview with a comment about what's going on in Alberta around the campaign. It looks like CPC numbers are going up, the Liberal numbers are going down, and at this point, would you say that the Liberal Party looked at Alberta and said, well, you know what, we're not making any gains there, so why don't we just cut our losses and do what's right?
I think there's some truth to that. I think the political calculus is such that you're not going to risk hundreds of seats in Ontario and Quebec to win 3 seats in Alberta. And Albertans have shown themselves to be frustratingly, almost blindly loyal to the Conservative Party of Canada, despite the fact that, again, you stack up their records on the energy sector and on what's good for it. I'll take the Liberal record any day of the week, twice on Sundays. But part of it is that the Liberals have not been aggressive in telling their story here in Alberta. They are afraid to say what they know is true about the things they've done. And yeah, if it comes down to it, they're going to pick Ontario over Alberta because there's more seats there. I've tried to explain that to people here for years now. The reason why politicians fall over themselves to cater to Quebec, because Quebec has way more seats and they put them up for grabs in every election. We don't do that here. Maybe if we were willing to elect more non-conservatives, more non-conservatives would put our issues first. But especially in a sort of increasingly narrow election where it looks like the Liberals could lose, they got to pull out all the stops. The one thing I would say is that they're not doing anything here to hurt Alberta. This is not punitive for Alberta. The policies that they've announced are good for Alberta, but they may not be political winners. And that's the choice, I guess, they have to make.
Max, always appreciate your insights. Thanks a bunch for this.
Anytime.